Catherine of Valois died on the 3rd of January, 1437. Her corpse would be a macabre tourist attraction for centuries. She was born in October 1401. Catherine's father was King Charles VI of France. Her first husband, Henry V, was King of England, but it was her union with her second husband that would create a new dynasty. Owen Tudor, as he's known today, was a Welsh household official of the widowed queen. They fell in love and contracted a scandalous marriage. Their sons would create the line of Tudor monarchs that ruled England for over a century. But Catherine, the mother of that dynasty, would be oddly disgraced after her death, and the situation ignored by her descendants. The cause of Catherine's death is uncertain. She had recently given birth, but there are some records to indicate she'd had a health issue for some time, and that is why she sought treatment or prayers at Bermondsey Abbey. She was 35 years old when she died on the 3rd of January. Catherine was given the splendid funeral of a queen, despite her scandalous remarriage to Owen Tudor. She was likely embalmed shortly after death by removing her internal organs to stave off decay and stuffing the cavity with herbs and spices. The corpse was wrapped in cerecloth, a heavy cloth coated in wax, and encassed in sheets of lead. This bundle was then put into a wood coffin. The organs that had been removed were placed in jars or boxes and were sometimes buried in separate locations. Often, some of the organs of the deceased would be buried in the churches. The funeral procession stopped at, but I've seen no mention of Catherine's organs being found at the one documented stop, St. Catherine's, the church of her patron saint. She was given a funeral there before the procession moved onward toward its final destination. Atop the coffin was laid an effigy of the deceased, usually dressed in their own clothing. Catherine's effigy was carved of wood and still survives in Westminster Abbey today. Painted in realistic colors, it has a long neck and a charming tilt to the head. Effigies were intended to look as much like the deceased as possible, so if Catherine's effigy followed this tradition, she was tall with a willowy figure. The effigy once would have had a wig of human hair attached to its head, brown according to the painted surface on the scalp. Her eyes were blue-gray. The effigy now wears only its painted red shift, but during the funeral, it wore a purple satin mantle. The coffin itself was swathed in cloth of gold, perched atop a huge hearse. On February 8, 1437, Catherine was given a second funeral service and laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey near her first husband, Henry V. For most people, the story would end here, but not for poor Catherine. It seems this tomb was intended to be temporary, and her son Henry VI wanted to devise a more appropriate memorial for her, but he died before he could decide what to erect in her memory. Her grandson, Henry VII, decided to demolish the Old Lady Chapel, where Catherine was buried, and build a new one, and Catherine's tomb was destroyed in the process, her body unearthed as they were digging the new foundations. Catherine's wood outer coffin was found to be badly decayed, and so her remains were taken out of it, and apparently from the inner lead coffin as well. They were put into a wood chest lined with flat sheets of lead, cut from the old roof of the chapel. The chest lay on the floor near her husband's tomb, and there it would remain for another 3 centuries. Some later claimed that Henry VII ordered the tomb's deliberate destruction in order to distance himself from his ancestry. However, he mentioned Catherine specifically in his will as someone he wanted to be buried with. It seems he envisioned the Lady Chapel as a family tomb for all of the Tudors. Henry VII died before the chapel could be completed, and some of his directives were never carried out by his son, Henry VIII. Henry never bothered to bury his great-grandmother, nor did any of the other Tudors who came along after him. The chest in which Catherine's body was placed appears to have had a lid in 2 sections, since later accounts say the lid would be opened to display her remains from waist up whenever visitors wanted to see her. Some curious soul stripped the cerecloth back from Catherine's face and chest, down to her legs, and found her remains intact, though desiccated. Since people describe her bare skin with no clothing over it, it appears Catherine was buried naked in her shroud and was displayed without its covering. It's said that the Abbey tour guides charged a shilling for visitors to get a peek at Catherine's remains, and her body was a popular tourist attraction for upwards of 300 years. There were legends that Catherine ended up as she did because she chose to give birth to Henry VI at Windsor against her husband's orders. Supposedly, Henry V had heard a prophecy that a prince born at Windsor would lose everything his father had gained and ordered her not to give birth there, but Catherine didn't listen. The legend reflects earlier judgments that Catherine couldn't contain her fleshly lust for Owen Tudor, so Catherine may have been seen as an unsympathetic person who ended up as a morbid curiosity through her own bad behavior. The famous diarist Samuel Pepys described a visit to the abbey and seeing Catherine's body. He had recently seen Shakespeare's production of Henry V, and that might have been what spurred his curiosity to see the real Kate who'd been wooed by a king. On Shrove Tuesday 1669, I to the abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth. Reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen, and this my birthday, and I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen. Several writers have speculated that kissing Catherine's corpse had become something of a tradition, referenced by Shakespeare in the play with several kisses for the queen who had witchcraft in her lips. But it seems the mistreatment of her body escalated as the 18th century passed. In 1786, Richard Gough wrote that in recent years, the young scholars at Westminster had amused themselves with tearing it to pieces. When Gough himself saw it, he reported the condition of the body as being a shapeless mass of a whitish color. In 1788, the situation was rectified somewhat when Catherine's remains were put into the Villiers vault when it was opened to admit the recently deceased Countess of Buckingham. There it lay, undisturbed, for almost 100 years, and memory began to fade. Her location was half forgotten when Dean Stanley, who restored other monuments in the abbey, began to search for Catherine in the records. In December 1877, Lord Percy died and his family tomb was being opened to admit his body. The Villiers vault was adjacent. With the permission of Queen Victoria, Dean Stanley's assistants waited until the evening after the funeral and then entered the Percy vault. They broke through the thin wall that separated the tombs to see if Catherine was really in the Villiers vault and retrieve her. Stanley's team found her remains on top of a pile of coffins beneath the Countess's effigy. The pile had tilted over and Catherine's coffin had fallen against a damp wall. The wood touching that wall had rotted into a soft, pulpy mush. When they tried to lift Catherine's coffin, it stuck to the coffin below. They managed to free it and slid a solid plank of wood beneath and shored up the pulpy side so they could move it. After considerable effort of shifting around in the small space, they managed to work the coffin free and lift it out of the vault. But the change in humidity had an immediate effect, and within a few hours, the coffin had fallen into fragments. Sadly, several portions of Catherine's body were found to be missing. It appeared to the examiners that the remains had been doused with lime, and several portions had been eaten away by it, but they may have misinterpreted the damage they saw. The entire front portion of her skull was gone, and one piece of the back of it was found lying on her pelvis. Most of her vertebrae were missing, as were all of her ribs except for 1 and 2 of her right arm bones. Though they searched, they found not a single one of her teeth. One of her clavicles was gone and had been replaced with a pelvic bone. The bones and teeth were likely nicked as souvenirs over the centuries. There seems to have been some accidental damage at this point because one of the contributors to the report notes that the bones were so fragile from the dampness that they powdered away when touched, like wet sand, but they hardened as they dried. Her legs, however, were found to still be encased in about 12 layers of cerecloth and in perfect condition. Amazingly, they report the skin still remaining on the right arm smoothed out as she dried, and her legs still appeared to be supple. Beneath her head, under the sheds of cerecloth she had lain on for the last 400 years, they found remnants of a wool pillow, still retaining a few fragments of the silk which had once covered it. Queen Victoria was presented with one of these shreds. They shored up the coffin a bit more and carried it into Henry V's chapel. They placed Catherine's remains into a new coffin, made of thick English oak. They put the pieces of the old chest inside the new one, along with an inscription plate explaining the journey her body had taken over the last 100 years. Lifting the altar slab, they built a new tomb beneath it, using gray marble, with a slab of slate inside on which the coffin would rest. Catherine finally had the tomb of a queen, 400 years after her death.